The day a woman looked at my work-worn, dirt-stained palms and declared they were too filthy to touch my newborn grandson, she had no idea she was setting an irreversible countdown clock in motion. Today, that clock just struck zero. My name is James Bennett. I am 67 years old, and you need to keep your eyes locked on this screen. What unfolded next is going to teach you a hard truth. The moment you mistake a father's patience for weakness, you begin liquidating your own life piece by piece. Soon, there is nothing left of your arrogance but dust. I had been awake since 4 a.m. on the morning of November 23rd, long before the sun cleared the southern evergreens. It wasn't because my body required it. My heart was simply beating too fast for sleep to catch hold. Just 3 days earlier, my son Gabriel had called from Atlanta. He told us his wife, Nora, had given birth to a healthy baby boy, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. They named him Samuel. At 67 years old, I felt a brand of excitement I hadn't known since Gabriel was born. I had spent 31 years teaching 8th grade American history in Macon, filling my evenings shaping timber in my shop. My wife, Dorothy, was beside herself in the passenger seat of my blue Ford F-150 as we pulled onto the interstate. She wore her best navy dress, the one with the white porcelain buttons. She had spent the previous evening preparing casseroles to freeze for the new parents. I wore my clean cotton button-down shirt, reserved strictly for church and Sunday suppers, entirely free of sawdust or grease. Resting securely in the back seat was the piece of my soul I had spent 6 weeks building. It was wrapped in thick brown butcher paper and tied with cotton twine. Every evening after dinner, I had retreated to my workshop, hand-carving a rocking horse from a solid block of kiln-dried red oak. I smoothed every curve until the grain felt like silk under my thumb. Then, I sealed it in a non-toxic oil finish so no harsh fumes would ever touch an infant's skin. Deep into the flank of the horse, using a wood-burning iron, I etched his name in strong, clean lettering, Samuel. I was so proud of that piece of work I could barely contain the breath in my chest. Dorothy kept reaching into the back row during the 4-hour drive north. She lightly touched the brown paper wrapper, reassuring herself the horse was still there, vibrant and whole. We pulled into Gabriel's neighborhood in Alpharetta just as the morning sun hit 10:30. It was one of those sprawling subdivisions where every multi-story residence is painted the exact same shade of dull beige. They were lined with manicured turf that looked more like plastic than living earth. I parked the F-150 in the driveway, hoisted the heavy wooden horse under my right arm, and smoothed my hair. Dorothy adjusted her collar and took my left arm. Together, we walked up the slate pathway toward the heavy double doors. When I rang the bell, I genuinely felt like the wealthiest man in Georgia. Gabriel answered the door. He looked exhausted in the way all brand new fathers do, eyes rimmed with red, hair slightly unkempt. Yet he carried that proud, beaming grin that makes a young man look 10 feet tall. "Dad, Mom, you made it," he said, stepping back to let us inside. "Come on in." That was the last uncomplicated, honest moment of the entire day. The house smelled overpowering. It wasn't the scent of a newborn or fresh laundry, but of expensive floral diffusers and chemical disinfectant. The entryway opened into a cavernous living room filled with immaculate white furniture and glass tables where nothing looked allowed to be touched. As we stepped through the foyer, I paused at the edge of the rug. The room was already occupied. Sitting on the oversized plush sofa was Nora. Seated alongside her were her parents, Richard and Beverly. Dressed in crisp, tailored weekend clothes, they exuded the effortless comfort of people who had been granted full access to the space for days. Beside Nora's section of the sofa stood a high-end white bassinet. Inside it, wrapped in a snow-white blanket, lay a tiny, sleeping boy. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Dorothy gasped softly, her fingers digging gently into my forearm. "Oh, James," she whispered, her voice trembling with devotion. "Look at him." Nora turned her head toward the doorway. I want to be clear about the expression that settled into her features. I have replayed those 2 seconds 10,000 times in the dark. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't a family welcome. It was a cold, calculating assessment. The exact look an estate dealer gives a piece of damaged furniture brought in from a barn. Her eyes swept down my work boots and lingered on my rough knuckles. She noted the modest cut of Dorothy's dress, then darted her gaze out the front window to where my old Ford truck sat parked in the sun. She flicked a brief glance toward her mother, Beverly, a coded message that carried more contempt than a shouted insult. I stepped forward into the living room, my arms instinctively opening. I held the heavy oak horse in one hand as I reached toward that bassinet with the other. It was the most natural impulse a human being could possess, a grandfather reaching out to touch his grandson after a 4-hour drive and a lifetime of waiting. Before my boot could hit the center rug, Nora stood up. She moved with a sudden, aggressive precision. She positioned her body directly between me and that bassinet like a security officer, blocking an intruder. She folded her arms across her chest and locked her eyes onto mine with disgust, speaking words that severed something fundamental in the room. "James, I'm sorry, but I'd rather you didn't step any closer. Look at your hands. You don't exactly maintain the cleanest conditions down there, and I will not have germs brought around my son. Don't touch him. And that goes for you too." She thrust a manicured finger toward my wife, Dorothy. The sentence hung in the air, scalding and heavy, freezing the very atmosphere of the room. The silence that followed Nora's words was a dense, suffocating weight. It pressed against the chest until breathing felt like swallowing broken glass. For 2 full seconds, nobody moved. I felt Dorothy's grip on my arm turn to ice. Her fingers clutched my sleeve with a desperate intensity, not to pull me back, but simply to keep herself from collapsing onto the polished hardwood floor. I looked directly at my son, Gabriel. I waited for the man I raised to step forward, to intervene, to say anything to protect his parents from such cruelty. But Gabriel didn't meet my gaze. He stared fixedly down at the rug, his jaw clenched, his shoulders hunched in shameful submission. Watching my only son choose cowardice over honor hurt worse than any insult Nora could ever hurl. It was a deep ache in a place I didn't even know a man could be wounded. Before the air could clear, Beverly, Nora's mother, stood up from the sofa without a trace of hesitation. With fluid grace, as if this entire sequence had been rehearsed behind closed doors, long before our truck turned onto their street. She reached into the bassinet. She lifted little Samuel into her arms, cradling the white blanket against her chest, and turned her back on us. As she walked toward the rear hallway leading to the nursery, she passed within arm's reach of my wife. She didn't glance sideways. She didn't nod. She navigated past Dorothy as if my wife were an invisible ghost, an unsightly piece of architecture that didn't deserve eye contact. I watched Dorothy watch her go. I saw the exact moment something vital and fragile inside my wife shattered. It was a devastating fracture caused not just by Nora's stinging words, but by the utter dehumanization of watching another woman carry her grandson away into the shadows. She stood there, stripped of her identity as a grandmother. I felt Dorothy's shoulders begin to vibrate with a violent shudder. She didn't sob out loud. She possessed too much ingrained Southern dignity to give them her tears in that house. But the sheer effort of holding it in made her whole body shake. I stood there for 3 long seconds, counting the beats in my head just to keep my hands steady. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice, slam my fist, or curse the people in that room. My mother had taught me decades ago that when the world shows you its worst, a real man responds with unshakable composure. I forced a faint, bitter smile onto my face, a dignified mask that covered the cold fury settling into my bones. Without breaking eye contact with Nora, I stepped forward and carefully laid the hand-carved oak rocking horse on its side across their spotlessly clean glass coffee table, right beside an expensive, scented candle. The heavy red oak made a dull, solid thud against the glass, an enduring piece of raw craftsmanship sitting in the middle of their artificial perfection. "I understand," I said softly, my voice steady. "Congratulations to you both." I placed my palm against the small of Dorothy's back, guiding her gently as we turned our backs on the room. We walked out the front door and down the slate pathway. We left behind the sterile walls, the fresh diffusers, and the son who had looked at the floor. We didn't speak about the clothes we had carefully ironed the night before. We didn't mention the 4 hours of driving. Nor did we mention the fact that our modest home on Ridgewood Lane in Macon had never once in 41 years of marriage harbored a dirty floor or a cold heart. I opened the passenger door, helped Dorothy into the cab of the F-150, and climbed into the driver's seat. I shifted the truck into reverse, backed out of the driveway, and turned the nose of the vehicle south toward home. The 4 hour drive back to Macon was wrapped in a silence colder and heavier than a Georgia winter storm. Dorothy sat staring out the passenger window at the endless stretch of roadside timber blurring along Interstate 75, her hands folded tightly over the purse in her lap. She didn't cry, and she didn't speak for the first 100 miles. I kept my left hand firmly over hers, feeling the coldness in her fingers, driving us through the fading afternoon light in a profound loneliness. The years that followed did not erase the sting of that morning. They merely compressed it into an enduring ache that lived in the corners of our home. 8 long years stretched out across the calendar, marked not by milestones shared, but by an unwavering one-sided devotion. Every single year, on the dates circled in thick red ink on our kitchen calendar, Samuel's birthday in November and Christmas in December, I returned to my workshop on Ridgewood Lane. I poured my heart into small tokens of a grandfather's love. I made handcrafted wooden trucks with wheels that spun smoothly, collected classic children's storybooks with carefully penned inscriptions on the inside covers, and wrote birthday cards containing modest checks drawn from my teacher's pension. Each package was wrapped neatly, addressed in my precise handwriting, and mailed directly from the post office on Vineville Avenue in Macon. Every single gesture was met with an impenetrable wall of silence. What neither Dorothy nor I knew, what we could not possibly have imagined during those long evenings, was that our gifts never even made it past the front entryway in Alpharetta. Nora had constructed a systematic blockade against our existence. With calculated precision, she intercepted every card, every wooden toy, and every letter before her husband or son could ever lay eyes on them. She didn't just throw them away. She treated them like contraband, stashing the unopened packages inside a heavy cardboard box. She shoved it into the dark, forgotten corners of the attic crawl space above the guest bedroom, hidden behind dusty holiday decorations and old suitcases. Whenever Gabriel felt a surge of filial guilt and attempted to reach out, whenever he picked up his phone to call my number in Macon, Nora was there to intercept the impulse. She would manufacture an immediate domestic crisis, pick an explosive argument over a trivial chore, or flatly claim that he was too busy with work to be indulging in nostalgia. She built an invisible wall between my son and his parents, brick by painstaking brick, using the threat of domestic warfare as her mortar. Inside that sprawling cookie-cutter mansion in Alpharetta, the cost of Nora's victory began to erode the very foundation of their lives. The glossy residence turned into a gilded prison. Gabriel was haunted by the memory of his own cowardice, the image of my weathered hands, Dorothy's trembling shoulders, and the wooden horse left sitting on the glass table. He found himself collapsing under a weight he couldn't vocalize. To numb the constant guilt of abandoning the people who raised him, he turned to the bottle. What started as a single glass of bourbon after work quickly escalated into 2, then 3. Soon, he was emptying full bottles of liquor before dinner was even served. Nora saw his descent into alcoholism and said nothing. She tolerated his addiction because addressing why Gabriel was drinking meant opening the locked door she had plastered over, the door that led straight back to Macon. They existed as 2 hollow ghosts moving through thousands of square feet of luxury. They were bound together only by a heavy mortgage, an isolated child, and an agreement never to speak the truth out loud. Meanwhile, back in Macon, I sat at my kitchen table every night before bed, folding my hardened palms together, whispering the exact same prayer into the dark. Lord, just let me live long enough to hold that boy once more. The artificial tranquility inside the Alpharetta house finally cracked on a rainy Tuesday evening during a routine dinner. Samuel was 8 years old now. He was a bright, Observant boy with dark hair and thoughtful eyes that took in far more than the adults around him realized. He was sitting at the formal dining table, pushing his vegetables around his plate, when he suddenly paused and looked up at his father. "Dad," he asked, his voice innocent and devoid of malice, "how come my friend Caleb has two grandpas and two grandmas who come to his baseball games, but I only have one of each?" Gabriel froze mid-bite, his fork suspended inches from his mouth as if paralyzed by the sheer weight of the question. Across the polished table, Nora's posture went instantly rigid. Her wineglass halted halfway to her lips as her eyes narrowed into a sharp, warning glare. The silence in the dining room became suffocating. It's it's complicated, buddy," Gabriel managed to choke out, his throat constricting so tightly he could barely push the air through his lungs. Unable to endure the innocent gaze of his son or the cold, controlling silence of his wife for another second, Gabriel abruptly pushed his chair back. He excused himself from the table and walked down the hallway to the master bathroom. He locked the heavy door, sank onto the cold tile floor, and wept like a broken child. His shoulders heaved with the realization that his cowardice was actively robbing his own son of a family's love. 2 weeks after that agonizing dinner, the catalyst for total disruption arrived from an unexpected direction. A successful 35-year-old architect named Brandon Cole, a former middle school student of mine from the late 90s, had submitted a feature article to the Macon Gazette back when he was a skinny kid drawing floor plans in the margins of his history notebooks. I had given him permission to build a custom birdhouse in my woodworking class instead of following the standard curriculum. That small act of trust had unlocked his passion for structural design. The article, titled "The Man Who Taught Me How to Build the Future," ran on a Sunday morning. It featured a large photograph of me standing in my dusty Macon workshop, holding a hand plane with a weathered smile, at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night, sitting alone in his parked car in his dark driveway because he couldn't stomach walking into his cold house. Gabriel stumbled upon the article on his phone. He stared at the photograph of my face under the ambient glow of the dashboard lights, reading every word about his father's dignity, patience, and legacy. The contrast between the honorable man described in the newspaper and the hollow, alcohol-dependent coward he had become in Alpharetta struck him like a physical blow to the chest. Looking at my eyes in that digital image, Gabriel felt the last lingering shreds of his compliance disintegrate. He set his phone down, wiped the tears from his face, and made a firm vow to the night air. He was done being a coward, and he was coming home to find his father. 3 weeks after reading that newspaper article in his driveway, Gabriel made his move on a crisp Saturday morning. He didn't tell Nora the truth. He simply stated he was taking 8-year-old Samuel to a day-long youth sports event across town, a harmless half-truth born of necessity that allowed them to slip away undetected. He drove 3 hours south along Interstate 75. The highway grew quieter as the sprawling suburbs of Atlanta faded into the tall, rustling Georgia pines of Bibb County. Sitting in the passenger seat, Samuel watched the landscape change while holding a notebook in his lap. He was entirely unaware that every mile brought him closer to a part of his life that had been hidden from him for 8 years. When the blue Ford F-150 parked in our driveway on Ridgewood Lane, I was in the front yard sweeping fallen pine needles off the porch steps. I froze, the broom handle locked tight in my calloused grip. The truck door opened, and Gabriel stepped out. He looked thinner than I remembered, his face lined with deep, weary regret, but it was the small boy stepping out behind him that made my lungs forget how to pull in air. Samuel walked up the concrete walkway with a calm, watchful curiosity. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, tilted his head up toward me with those bright, dark eyes, and asked in a serious voice, "Are you my Grandpa James?" I couldn't speak for 3 long seconds. The broom dropped from my hand, clattering against the timber floorboards. "Yes, son," I finally managed to choke out, my voice raspy and thick with emotion. "I am." Before I could take a step down, Samuel let go of his father's hand. He walked right up the steps and wrapped his small arms tightly around my waist. burying his face against my shirt, as if his heart had been rehearsing this exact moment for years. I collapsed onto my knees on that porch, holding my grandson against my chest. I whispered a tearful prayer of thanks to the sky, refusing to let go for a very long time. Gabriel stood at the foot of the steps, tears streaming down his cheeks, making no effort to wipe them away. From inside the house, the screen door creaked open, and Dorothy stepped out, dropping her dish towel to the floor. When her eyes landed on Samuel, she let out a soft gasp, a sound carried through 8 years of longing. She dropped to her knees right beside me, wrapping her arms around the boy, as if terrified he might vanish into thin air. We spent the entire morning in my backyard workshop. The air smelled of freshly sawn lumber, natural oil finish, and decades of honest labor. I pulled a sturdy wooden crate up to my main workbench so Samuel could reach the vise, and together we worked on a small pine keepsake box. I showed him how to hold a hand plane, how to check the grain for smoothness, and how to use a square with patience. His hands were remarkably steady for an 8-year-old, moving with a natural precision that made my chest swell with pride. In the kitchen, Dorothy prepared a feast of fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet biscuits. She sat across the table during lunch, just watching Samuel eat with an expression of pure disbelief, as if proving to herself that her grandson was finally real and sitting under her roof. After lunch, while Samuel was in the backyard conducting a thorough inspection of my tomato plants, Gabriel and I sat alone at the kitchen table. 2 white ceramic mugs of black coffee sat between us, the steam rising softly into the quiet room. 8 years of unsaid truths, unread letters, and heavy guilt hovered over the table like a physical weight. Gabriel stared down into his mug, his knuckles white as his hands trembled. He tried to speak twice, but his voice failed him. On the third attempt, the dam inside him broke completely. Dad, his voice cracked on the single syllable, his shoulders heaving as he dropped his head into his hands, sobbing. I should have never let this happen. I stood in that living room 8 years ago and I said nothing. I was a coward. I let her insult you and Mom, and I let her rob Samuel of the people who love him most. I failed you, I failed Mom, and I failed my own son. I don't even deserve to sit at your table, Dad. I'm so deeply sorry. He sat there, a grown 38-year-old man broken into pieces by the weight of his own remorse. I didn't yell. I didn't deliver a lecture on duty or honor, nor did I recite a list of the painful years we had endured in silence. I simply reached across the wooden table, laid my heavy, rough-hewn hand firmly over his trembling shoulder, and spoke 5 soft, steady words. Drink your coffee before it gets cold, son. Gabriel let out a wet, ragged laugh through his tears, wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, and took a sip. It wasn't a total erasure of the past 8 years, but it was the first real step toward rebuilding the bridge between a father and his son. 1 cup of coffee at a time. Back in Alpharetta, the secret weekend trips to Macon had fundamentally altered Gabriel's perspective. With the fog of alcohol and guilt finally lifting from his mind, he began to observe the sterile suburban mansion not as a sanctuary, but as a meticulously managed crime scene. He started noticing the missing pieces of his own life, the intercepted mail, the suspicious hang-ups on the home phone, the way Nora controlled every piece of incoming correspondence. One humid Thursday afternoon, while Nora was out attending a luncheon at her country club, Gabriel finally went looking for the truth. He pulled down the heavy wooden ladder leading into the sweltering, dust-filled attic crawl space above the guest bedroom. Moving aside plastic bins of expensive color-coordinated Christmas ornaments and vintage luggage, he swept his flashlight across the shadows and spotted it. A heavy, battered cardboard box pushed aggressively against the far insulation wall, hidden deep in the dark as if it were a shameful secret. Gabriel dragged the heavy box into the harsh light of the single attic bulb and ripped through the layers of packing tape. Inside lay an absolute graveyard of 8 stolen years. There were dozens of unopened birthday packages wrapped in brown butcher paper. There were hand-carved wooden toys, their edges smoothed by my working-class hands, and small, colorful children's books with my neat handwriting visible on the inner margins. but it was the stack of Christmas cards that made Gabriel's chest physically cave in. He opened a faded envelope addressed to his son, immediately recognizing his mother's careful, looping script. Tucked inside the card was a small, tear-stained note that read, "We think about you every single day, sweet boy." Gabriel sat alone in the stifling heat of the attic for 20 minutes, holding Dorothy's unread note against his heart, feeling the very last remnants of his marriage turn to ash in his hands. When Nora's luxury SUV pulled into the garage later that afternoon, Gabriel was already waiting. He sat perfectly still at the pristine marble kitchen island, the dusty cardboard box resting dead center under the designer pendant lights. Nora walked into the kitchen, tossing her keys onto the counter, her superficial smile freezing instantly the second her eyes registered the box. All the color drained from her face. "You told me they stopped trying," Gabriel said, his voice terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of the desperate pleading he usually employed to keep the peace. "You told me they abandoned us after year 1. 8 years, Nora. My mother wrote letters to my son that he never even got to read. You stole my parents from my son." Caught in an undeniable physical web of her own cruelty, Nora did what arrogant people do when they are entirely cornered. She attacked. Her face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation, desperately attempting to reassert her dominance over the man she had controlled for nearly a decade. She crossed her arms, lifted her chin with an unbelievable sense of entitlement, and delivered her final ultimatum. "I am your wife," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You are going to have to make a choice right now. It's either me or those people. You choose me or you choose them." Gabriel didn't flinch. He didn't drop his gaze. And he didn't look at the floor like he had 8 years ago. He stood up, towering over the ruins of their life together, and looked her dead in the eyes with an icy clarity. "You are the reason this family is broken, Nora," he replied, his words sharp and clinical as a surgeon's blade. "Not them." Gabriel picked up the box, walked past her without granting her another syllable of his time, and moved into the guest bedroom, locking the door behind him. The very next morning, Gabriel didn't just walk away. He went on a ruthless offensive. He drove straight into the wealthy Buckhead district of Atlanta and hired Douglas Holt, one of the most feared family law attorneys in Georgia. Gabriel unilaterally filed a high-fault petition for divorce, slamming the 8 years of hidden correspondence onto the lawyer's desk as irrefutable evidence of severe parental alienation and psychological manipulation. The era of his silence was officially over, and Nora's house of cards was entirely liquidated. Panic is a ruthless revealer of character, stripping away years of artificial sophistication in a matter of hours. Realizing that Douglas Holt's aggressive divorce petition threatened her entire financial stability and social standing, Nora executed a final gamble. On a scorching Thursday afternoon, she loaded 8-year-old Samuel into her luxury SUV and sped 3 hours south toward Macon. She wasn't seeking reconciliation out of remorse. She was bringing the child as a strategic shield, intending to leverage my paternal sympathy to force Gabriel back into line. I was standing in my backyard workshop, sanding the curved leg of a red oak rocking chair with old country music playing softly on the radio, when I heard tires crunching against the gravel driveway. Dorothy walked out to the kitchen porch, her eyes widening in sheer disbelief as Nora stepped out of the vehicle. Her designer clothes were disheveled, and her eyes were reddened behind oversized sunglasses. Holding Samuel firmly by the wrist, Nora marched up the walkway and onto my porch. Looking at me with a theatrical mask of helplessness, she uttered a word that made the air turn cold. "Dad, please, you have to talk to Gabriel. He's ruining our family." I didn't yell. I didn't shut the door in her face. I simply looked at her across 8 years of unvarnished hostility, then opened the screen door and gestured toward the backyard. "Come with me, Nora," I said quietly, my voice utterly devoid of emotion. "I want to show you something." Samuel immediately let go of her hand and ran toward Dorothy, wrapping his arms around his grandmother's waist, where he belonged. I guided Nora down the wooden ramp and into my 12 by 16-foot workshop. The room was cool, filled with the rich, honest scent of freshly planed timber and varnish. Along the east wall, resting neatly on sturdy pine shelves I had constructed with my own hands, sat the evidence of her decade-long campaign. Every single hand-carved wooden toy, every storybook, and every unopened birthday package that Gabriel had recovered from her attic was now meticulously stacked and organized by year. Nora froze in the center of the sawdust floor, her eyes darting across the shelves as her face drained of every drop of color. She realized in an instant that her elaborate lie had been completely cataloged. Before she could speak or construct another defensive narrative, I picked up a thick, leather-bound folder from my primary workbench and laid it flat between us. "Every single year that you hid those packages," I said, my voice dropping into a firm, unyielding register, "I deposited the financial equivalent of those gifts into an irrevocable educational trust fund for Samuel. It was funded entirely by my teacher's pension and extra woodworking projects." Nora hesitantly opened the folder, her manicured fingers trembling as she scanned the certified banking statements. The balance was indisputable. A fully matured trust account containing enough capital to pay for 4 full years of tuition, housing, and books at any public university in Georgia. The woman who had barred me from holding my grandson, who had declared my labor-shaped hands too dirty to touch her child, stared at the numbers in utter shock. While she had been hiding birthday cards in the dark, the man she deemed too poor had been quietly securing her son's future behind her back. At that exact moment, the screen door opened, and Samuel walked into the shop alongside Dorothy and Gabriel, who had arrived just minutes behind her. The 8-year-old boy looked at his mother, then at the shelves lined with 8 years of love. He spoke words that permanently shattered Nora's remaining pride. "Mom, Grandpa and Grandma never forgot about me. Not even once." Nora crumpled onto an old wooden workbench, her face buried in her hands, completely undone by the weight of her own defeated arrogance. The audit was complete, and she was left entirely empty-handed. The legal battle in Atlanta was neither swift nor merciful, but when Douglas Holt laid out the evidence, the outcome was absolute. The Fulton County Family Court judge reviewed the 8 years of hidden correspondence, the documented emotional alienation, and the paper trail of Nora's systematic campaign to erase an entire family from a child's life. The verdict was delivered with sharp, devastating finality. Gabriel was awarded primary physical and legal custody of Samuel. Nora was left stripped of her leverage, forced to face the harsh reality of her own making. A quiet, cramped apartment on the outskirts of town, no spousal maintenance, and a severely restricted, supervised visitation schedule. Her luxury lifestyle, her social standing, and her artificial narrative of superiority were completely liquidated in a single courtroom session. With the legal storm behind them, Gabriel and Samuel relocated down to Macon, moving into a charming home just 3 doors down from us on Ridgewood Lane. Our quiet neighborhood on Ridgewood Lane was instantly filled with new life. Every Saturday morning, without fail, the heavy wooden door of my workshop swings open and Samuel walks in. He pulls his safety glasses over his eyes with that same serious, focused expression he inherited from the Bennett line. Together, we have been working on a full-sized red oak rocking chair, smoothing the armrests, fitting the mortise and tenon joints, and sealing the wood with care. His hands are growing steadier every single week, carrying the craft forward with natural pride. Inside our home, sitting proudly on the brick's mantel in the living room right next to the original red oak rocking horse I built 8 years ago, rests a newly framed photograph taken in my workshop on a bright October afternoon. In it, Samuel is leaning over the workbench, concentrating intently on a piece of timber. Dorothy stands in the background, her arms crossed, wearing that radiant smile she gets when everything in her world is finally right. And beside the boy, I am standing with my heavy, weathered hand resting securely on his shoulder, looking like the happiest man in the state of Georgia. When I look back on everything we endured, I am reminded of a simple truth. True wealth has nothing to do with glossy mansions, expensive candles, or manicured lawns. The woman who looked at my working-class hands and declared us too poor to touch her child turned out to be the poorest person in the entire room. bankrupt in character, lacking in love, and devoid of human warmth. In the end, time is an unyielding auditor, and quiet, patient dignity will always outlast loud, arrogant cruelty. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Dad's Ultimate Payback. If this story of a grandfather's unwavering patience, a son's courageous awakening, and the ultimate restoration of a family line touched your heart today, please take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story of absolute justice. Drop a comment below, letting me know the exact city, state, or country you are watching from today. A massive shout out to our loyal viewer, Christina Scott from New Mexico. Keep your boundaries strong, protect your family legacy, and I will see you all in the next briefing.